Hey everyone. Now we'll go ahead and get started in a minute here. Just trying to make sure the waiting room gets cleared out. And I've got an announcement to make at the top here. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining for City Forum, our bi-weekly seminar series here in the graduate program in community and regional planning. I just wanted to announce another event that's happening in the School of Architecture that is probably of interest to folks who are here. So on November 15th, we're going to have our first face-to-face one-on-one conversation that's sponsored by the Code Committee. So it's the Committee on Diversity and Equity here in the School of Architecture, but it's being run by our graduate students. And they're going to be having a conversation with folks from the Community Powered Workshop. So this includes a couple UT alums, Thomas Medina and Siobhan Otero. So that's going to be on November 15th at 12:30. There is going to be an in-person component to the event, so it's hybrid. If you'd like to attend in person, I think they just ask that you RSVP using this QR code. And if folks are interested in getting the flyer, you can contact me, or I assume the details of the event are online. And if you sign up, I think there are 25 in-person spots, and food will be provided for those who are able to attend in person. I think the idea of this event is that we didn't want to have yet another event where there's kind of an individual speaker kind of lecturing on a topic, but we wanted to have more of an interactive conversation where students could ask questions and kind of probe in a little bit more detail about folks' experiences related to equity and justice related matters. So check that out if you're interested. I will stop my share and introduce our speaker for today. So we're super lucky to have our very own Jake Wegman here as our speaker for City Forum today. Hi, Jake. So Jake is an associate professor, I assume most of you know him, in community and regional planning, and he's been on the faculty since 2014. His scholarship addresses housing issues from various different dimensions. So he's looked at housing affordability, informal housing, land use policy, and real estate development. And there are many things that I really like about Jake. One is that his work has been especially influential in Austin. So in particular, the co-authored Uprooted report on gentrification and displacement risks in the city. I think it's become required reading for anyone who's interested in those issues here in Austin. And it's constantly mentioned and referred to in discussions with city staff and advocates. So it's a super influential report. It comes up all the time. His paper on measuring informal housing production in California cities was awarded Best Paper in the Journal of the American Planning Association in 2017, as well as a UT-wide award from the University Co-op Society. They give an award for the best research paper across the entire university. And another couple things I like about Jake is just that he's such a clear, cogent, and compelling thinker. And he's great at taking complex topics and ideas and distilling them down so they can be understood by students and members of the public. So this is reflected in his teaching and community service. And to me, that's the mark of a great planning scholar. So today he'll be speaking with us about Houston and what its lack of zoning can tell us about what a post-single family zoning future could look like across the country. So I'll turn it over to Jake. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak at City Forum. Thanks also to Tony for his superb, support and organizing. And I love the Community Powered Workshop event coming up. I'm on the board. Our own Michael Oden and Elizabeth Mueller have both been on the board at times in the past, and that's an organization with deep ties to School of Architecture. So I just think it'll be awesome for students to get to hear from a couple of our alums who are working there and making things happen. So thanks so much for that. I am going to bring up my PowerPoint, and I hope everyone can see it okay. So the title of my talk is Want to Know What a Post-Single Family Zoning Future in Your City Could Look Like? Houston Would Like a Word. And if you are profoundly confused by that title, because you know that Houston doesn't have zoning, well, I'll get to that in a little bit here. But first, let's talk about this thing called single family zoning. If you were to ask me what is the most distinctive thing about planning in the United States that makes it different from anywhere else in the entire world, I would say it's single family zoning. And the Platonic ideal of single family zoning is to create and to preserve places like this in this picture. Maybe the trees change from place to place and the houses have different styles and so on and so forth. But the underlying idea is that a place like this is the highest form of human habitat and that it deserves special protection. That's really just at the core of this idea. And here I'm going to quote from Sonia Hurt of the University of Georgia, who wrote a fantastic book called Zoned in the USA. If you really want to read about this, where this comes from, that's a great place to turn. She says, I could find no evidence in other countries that this particular form, the detached single family home, is routinely, as in the United States, considered to be so incompatible with all other types of urbanization as to warrant a legally defined district all its own, a district where all other major land uses and building types are outlawed. So what she's doing there is so useful because, if you live in the United States, if you grew up here, this is just kind of in the water, it's in the air we breathe. It's so natural that we don't even think about it. And yet it's profoundly strange in the context of history and even in the context of, most other countries. So this is a picture of a block that I lived on, when I was a young adult, which is, longer ago than I care to admit. This is the 10,000 block of Pearl Street in Denver. I lived, let's see, there we go. That arrow is pointing at where I live. That was the first condo I ever owned. I bought it for $120,000. This single family house, along with 4 others around it, had been converted at some point into condos. And so each floor of these houses was a condo. So I bought one of them. But, what are we looking at? Here's what looks like a single family house, but it's really 2 units. Right next door is a small apartment building. Next door to that is a single family house. Single family zoning says that places like this should be prevented, or they should not be allowed to, existing places shouldn't be allowed to evolve into places like this, and new places like it shouldn't be built. Have any of you ever been to Avenue B Grocery in Hyde Park? I think it's a very charming sandwich shop. It's actually in the middle of the block, Avenue B. And if you look at it closely, you see that there was originally a single family house built behind it, next to other single family houses. You can see one over here on to its left. And then at some point, whoever owned the single family house decided to just build a little storefront onto the front of it. And that's where this kind of charming sandwich shop is located. Again, single family zoning says, we don't want that. We want to try to actively intervene to prevent this sort of thing from happening. And, the striking fact about single family zoning is just how omnipresent it is. So a couple of years ago, the New York Times did this fantastic series on a feature on single family zoning, and they did these amazing maps that their graphical team can do. And they quantified the percentage of the land area in various cities that's devoted to single family detached zoning. And so here's Charlotte. Everything that is either purple or bluish is the residentially zoned land in Charlotte. And then in Charlotte, 84% of that residential land is zoned for this particular housing type, detached single family homes. Seattle, 81%. Chicago, which you might think of as a very transit dependent city and in a denser city, it's still 79%. So just huge amounts of land being devoted. Now, New York City, of course, is the great exception. It's just totally unlike any other city in this country. Even there, 15% of the residential land is zoned for detached single family in 4 out of the 5 boroughs, not Manhattan. Now, unfortunately, the New York Times didn't make one of these maps for Austin, but this is a map this is from 10 years ago, but it basically hasn't changed since then. And all you need to know is that everything that's in yellow is some form of single family zoning. So, Austin's like almost every other US city in devoting the vast majority of its land to single family zoning. As I was procrastinating the other day when I really should have been putting this talk together, I was, reading some news, and I came across this little piece about the comprehensive plan for Rollingwood. Rollingwood is a tiny little city that is weirdly 4 miles from downtown Austin, but it's its own city. And here's this quote. Most of the feedback we got was that people want Rollingwood to stay in many ways the same and maintain its character as a single family tree canopied suburban community. And I mean, that quote, in terms of newsworthiness, might as well be this morning, the sun rose this morning as it has for all previous mornings in world history. I mean, this is just the default all across this country. And it results in, I would argue, some pretty absurd and crazy outcomes. Some of you may have seen this story from last month by Audrey McGlinchey of KUT Radio, The Battle for 3000 Funston Street. Speaking of community powered workshop, this is a project that community powered workshop is involved with. The city owns this land parcel. It's a vacant piece of land, as you can see on the left, between two other single family houses. It backs right up to the Mopac freeway. The city owns this parcel because it's sort of a holdover from when the freeway was constructed back in the day. And the city of Austin would like to build a small house on that parcel and sell it at a below market rate so that a moderate income family could live in this very high-end, highly advantaged neighborhood of Riker Woods, where the median house price in the zip code is 1.3 million. The city would like to sell this house for under 300,000, and yet because of a lawsuit involving the neighbors, which I won't get into the details of that, the costs of building this house are nearing $500,000, and that's not even including the land cost. So what a crazy outcome of single family zoning. Right now, maybe the city of Austin could choose to ignore its own zoning, but clearly, they think that would be a bad look. But if it weren't for single family zoning, you could easily fit multiple units on this parcel. You could give, 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 families the opportunity to live at a reasonable price in this location with the top rated public schools and all those other advantages. But instead, at enormous cost, it's just going to be one household that gets to live there. And it's, arguably because of single family zoning. So in case my feelings on the matter aren't sufficiently clear, a couple of years ago, I wrote this kind of screed, calling for the end of single family zoning. And there is a sort of a gathering movement to do that. But for years, this just seemed like a totally quixotic idea that just, oh, come on. Get serious. No one's ever going to actually undo single family zoning. It's the third rail of American land use politics. Well, the interesting thing is that is just beginning to change, and it's very, very recent. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Minneapolis, which is really the first big US city to consciously undo single family zoning, although not without controversy, of course. Portland kind of followed not that long thereafter with something called the residential infill program. Although actually I realize I jumped the gun. This is one of the 3 unit properties buildings that you can now build on any residential lot in Minneapolis as a result of this rezoning. Doesn't it look terrifying? Doesn't it look like the world is going to come to an end? Okay, here's Portland, their residential infill project. So they followed after Minneapolis. In some ways, they went even further because in their rules, they incentivize builders to build multi-unit buildings because you get to build more square footage if you cut it up into multiple units than if you just have it as one big house. And even states are getting the act now. So the first one was Oregon, not surprisingly, Oregon is, a leader in so many ways in planning in this country. And so in 2019, they passed this House Bill 2001, which effectively ends single-family zoning in almost every city statewide, except for the smallest incorporated cities. And unbelievably, just a few weeks ago, California passed something called Senate Bill 9, which now allows 4 units to potentially be built on every single family zoned lot up and down the entire state. So this, the times they are changing, things are happening. And there's been some interest in other places, including even in some red states, although nothing has passed yet. But there have been rumblings about reforming single family zoning in Nebraska and North Carolina and other places. So something does seem to be happening. So what happens next? I don't know. It's a kind of an interesting and exciting moment. But a big looming question is, what happens when you repeal single family zoning? Does it make things more affordable? Does it increase racial and socioeconomic integration? Does it do all these things that those of us who argue for it say that it will do? And for the most part, we say, well, we don't really know because just not enough time has passed since these things have happened. And that brings me to my core argument here, which is that, and bear with me here, Houston, of all places, ended the equivalent of single family zoning way back in 1998. So it behooves the rest of us to learn from what has actually happened there. But you say, Houston doesn't have any zoning, right? We all know that. Houston is famously the only large city in the United States that never got around to adopting zoning, or just more accurately, has considered it a couple of times and then rejected it. The voters have rejected it. And so, as we all know, because there's no zoning in Houston, just anyone can do anything that they want, and Houston looks like this, right? Not quite, actually. This is a rendering created by an artist named Carrie Marie Schneider, which I just love. I love the imagination in it. I wish you could walk down a street in Houston and see a halal meat place above, I don't know, right next to a second story Vietnamese supermarket, but that's not what Houston looks like. The wonderful diversity and entrepreneurialism of Houston is not reflected so exuberantly in its urban environment. And that's because Houston might not be zoned, but it has plenty of land use regulation. And that's the core argument of a legal review piece from Michael Lewin from way back in 2004. And his argument in this piece is basically, yeah, Houston doesn't have zoning, and that's, that matters in some ways, but it's also not as big of a deal as people think. And in fact, if you look at, the on the ground outcomes, for the most part, Houston just kind of looks like any other Sunbelt city, and anywhere else in the country that does have zoning. So sometimes this idea of Houston as kind of an unregulated wonderland of total regulatory freedom is really overblown. It has regulations, they're not called zoning. But now I'm going to give an asterisk to the asterisk. Houston did do something really interesting in 1998, and they chose to change their land use regulations that in such a way that an explosion of townhouse development happened in the wake of that. And the real definitive account of this came out just last year in Journal of Planning, Education, and Research, a real seminal paper, which I'm really going to kind of rely on here for my account, by Nolan Gray and Adam Millsap. But this really tells the story. But to summarize it really quickly, kind of what they did. In 1998, Houston's City Council, they reduced their minimum lot size requirement from 5,000 square feet, which is a fairly typical minimum lot size that you'll find in lots of large cities throughout the U.S., all the way down to 1,400. So a big reduction in the minimum lot size. Initially, this was only inside what's called the inner loop, which you can think of as the sort of extended urban core of Houston. But then later they extended it to the entire city in 2007. And the result, according to Gray and Millsap, has been the construction of 25, give or take roughly 25,000 townhouses. Now, I think their analysis was as of a few years ago, so it's probably more than that by now. And I'm putting townhouses in scare quotes for reasons that I'll mention in a minute. Now, one other really interesting thing about what Houston has done is, as many of you I'm sure know, Houston doesn't have zoning. Instead, it relies heavily on private contracts or deed restrictions to enforce a lot of land use restrictions. And unlike any other city in the entire United States, there's even a special exception in Texas state law that applies only to Houston. The machinery of city government in Houston is used to uphold these private deed restrictions. And a couple of years after the 1998 reform passed in 2001, Houston passed something that allows a mechanism called a special minimum lot size or a special minimum building line. And basically, this is if you live on a block and you can get a majority of the property owners on your block to agree, you can petition for your block to get a special set of rules that apply only to the block that effectively are going to prevent townhouse development from happening. So it's a really unique system. It's troubling in some ways. I mean, in some ways, it smacks of 18th century democracy, where participation in public affairs requires property ownership. On the other hand, Gray and Millsap argue, and I think pretty convincingly, that the 1998 reform probably would have been reversed due to backlash had this kind of mechanism not been put in place. So I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. But anyway, as of a few weeks ago, when I went to the city website, these were the blocks, primarily within the inner loop, which is that sort of like gray freeway loop you can see. Mostly inside the inner loop, you can see these places that have opted out of allowing townhouse development to happen. So now I'm just going to flash through a few images of some of the townhouses that have gotten built. And so one thing I want to make clear is that in Houston, townhouse in local parlance means a tall, skinny house. And townhouses sometimes touch each other on the sides, and sometimes they're actually detached. So what we're looking at here, these are technically single-family detached houses. So in a way, you could say, what are you talking about? This is still single-family detached housing. But this is single-family detached housing that looks nothing like single detached housing that you find, almost anywhere else in this whole country. I mean, with a few very limited exceptions. Here is an example where the housing is attached. And by the way, these houses can get as tall as 5 stories sometimes. Here's a group of townhouses in a larger development, very close to downtown. Here's another one of detached housing. Here's an example of the kind of more modernist design vocabulary. There's sort of a riotous variety of different, configurations of townhouses that have been built in the wake of this regulation. Here's kind of more traditional design. And here's something that, I don't know, it almost looks like something you'd see in, somewhere in Europe. So just real different expressions of this townhouse form. So what I want to talk about here as a contribution that I'm looking to make is some analysis of what I'm going to call residential to townhouse redevelopment, or R2TH if you want to get cute about it. And this is some work that is in collaboration with Josh Conrad, who is a historic preservation PhD student who's an absolute whiz at working with large data sets and is using it to kind of come up with new insights in his field. And what we're looking at here is a specific subcategory of the townhouse development that's happened in Houston, one where residential lots have been purchased by developers, the existing house demolished, and then subdivided into townhouses. Because of course, a lot of townhouse development has occurred on commercial or industrial parcels rather than residential. And why focus on R2TH? Well, it's so much of the concern about repealing single family zoning in other cities has, the greatest controversy tends to be about this idea of townhouse development occurring on residential parcels. So that's what we're sort of focusing in on here. So to do this, we pulled property tax data from the years 2005 through 2020 inclusive. So like data for 2005, data for 2006. So all the way up to 2020, that's a lot of data. It requires sifting through, voluminous property tax records. And Josh, in working on this, he discovered that Harris County has something called tieback tables. And this is very esoteric, but this is sort of the key here, is that every year they publish a list of new parcels that have been created as a result of subdividing or recombining older parcels that have been eliminated. And the tieback table links together the new parcel to the property tax ID of the old parcels. And so that is what kind of enabled him to sort of crack this code here. And with that, we can now answer some questions about R2TH development, like how much of it is there? And where has it taken place? And what's been lost or demolished, and then what has been built in its place. So let me just kind of run through a few of our findings before I kind of get to the big picture, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. But here's sort of the basic numbers. So by our count, there have been 1,392 cases between 2005 and 2020 in which a residential parcel has been purchased and then subdivided, the existing housing on it knocked down, and then replaced with newly built townhouses. And this has yielded just under 5,000 new build townhouses. That's a weird looking number. It sort of looks like some kind of coincidence or something, but we checked it. It is actually 4,999. Here's the spatial pattern. Again, we're looking at the inner loop here, and just as a sense of scale, the diameter of this inner loop is, call it, it's about 6 or 7 miles, roughly speaking. So, we do see these clumps of this kind of development occurring in particular areas. And, how does this relate to the parts of the city that are gentrifying? Well, you're going to have to do some squinting. I hope to do kind of more formal analysis of this later, doing some real GIS work. But for now, we can just sort of look at a gentrification map on the right, produced by the Rice University's Kinder Institute. This is from a report of theirs from a few years ago. And all you really need to know here is that the census tracts that are in various shades of blue are the ones that they have identified according to their methodology as in some stage of gentrification in the last 20 years. And if you sort of squint, you kind of see that for the most part, these pink blotches are mostly not in the blue tinged census tracts. At least that's the sort of high level takeaway. And that's consistent with what Millsap and what Gray and Millsap found in their seminal article in Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. And then also, if we put up the R2TH map kind of side by side with where these little block level votes have taken place to exempt areas from townhouse development, I mean, not surprising, the pink clumps are kind of not overlapping with these areas. Although in some cases they're quite close by. So I think there's an interesting possibility. Could it be that these votes tend to happen once townhouse development starts occurring nearby, that spurs property owners to sort of react by, organizing their neighbors to vote and stop this kind of development. I think that's going to be an interesting thing for me to look at as I continue with this line of inquiry. And what about the size of the redevelopments? I mean, most of them are, the modal size of a redevelopment is just 2 units. So in other words, the modal case is one where one residential lot gets replaced with 2 townhouses. But, there are others with 3, 4, 5, 6, or even more new townhouses, but, those are a lot rarer. So most of them are kind of these, very small redevelopments of just a few units, just a few townhouse units at a time. And then this graph, this is just showing the frequency of the houses that are demolished to make way for the redevelopments by the year in which the original house was built. So the vast majority of the houses that are being torn down to make way for townhouses were built before 1951, as you can see in this graph. And then in this table, this is just a few ways of thinking about how can we quantify the degree to which the new townhouse development more intensively uses the land than what was there before. So one way to think about it is in this top row of this table. What is the ratio of the value that the tax assessor placed on the property before redevelopment versus after redevelopment? And it's a 4.1 to 1 ratio. So this land is being assessed at over 4 times the value of what was being assessed there before. And then the ratio is even greater when you look at the square footage of built buildings that were there before versus after, 5.5 to 1 in the median case. What about the sizes of the housing units that are torn down versus the sizes of the new housing units that are put up? The median house that's torn down is 1,348 square feet. And then the median new townhouse that gets built as a result of this process is just under 2,500 square feet. So, this is what you might call family-sized housing. Now, whether children actually are living in the townhouses is a different question, but these at least could be family-sized housing, which is, a big area of concern. Lots of people worry about family-sized housing being squeezed out of urban cores. Something different seems to be happening in Houston. And then the median lot sizes, the median lot that gets subdivided is 6,500 square feet. And then the median new townhouse that gets built sits on its own lot of 2,100 square feet. So for all of you kind of urban design types in the house who think about floor area ratio, FAR, the median new townhouse that's being built has an FAR of over 1, which is, that's often thought of as sort of the threshold between a kind of a very urban feeling place and a not urban feeling place. So what are some of our takeaways here? I mean, just to summarize, this is, this R2TH redevelopment, it's a real minority of the overall townhouse development, and roughly speaking, about 15%, but lots of caveats because the time intervals aren't totally overlapping. It could be that some of the townhouse development that we see from 2005 to 2020, the lots had already been subdivided before then. So I have more to do to sort of figure out what the real proportion is. But I think it's pretty clear that a lot of townhouse development is not happening via residential to townhouse development. Rather, it's a subdivision of commercial or industrial parcels. It seems to mostly avoid gentrifying neighborhoods so far. The Kinder Institute in a recent report raised concerns that may be changing. Some people that I've interacted with who are, highly knowledgeable about development in Houston, they have a different perception that townhouse development is associated with gentrification in areas like Third Ward. And so I don't know if it's just a case that the townhouses are so visible, so they've become a symbol of gentrification, even though that's not the main setting where it's happening, or if there is a real shift. Bottom line, I think this warrants more attention and scrutiny. There's clearly a drastic increase in the intensity of land use that's going on here. So this is like the opposite of single family zoning that you see in other cities. You know, these areas that had been single family detached are undergo this kind of drastic change through townhouse development. And again, there's a provision of child-friendly housing in abundance in the urban core, which is absolutely not happening in most growing US cities. I think this is just a completely unique phenomenon to Houston. But that leaves a lot of unanswered questions. Like I said before, are children actually living in the new townhouses? I have no way of knowing who's living in townhouses, but in some follow-up research, I would like to look at things like school enrollment trends, which could give some clues as to whether there's a gain in the child population in some of these areas. Who's buying the new townhouses, right? There might be some creative ways to get a sense of that. Who's building the new townhouses? Is it large developers? Is it small, scrappy local builders? Are any nonprofits getting in on the action, or is it entirely for-profit market rate builders that are doing that? I think that would be interesting to know. Again, what's the relationship between townhouses and gentrification? That seems like a pretty urgent question to answer, because fears about further fueling gentrification are so often a big source of the reluctance to repeal single-family zoning in many other cities across the country, very much including Austin. Where are townhouses, likely to get built? Can you kind of identify quantitatively some patterns about which places seem to be the most likely to get townhouse development? And then here's sort of a more big picture question, one that I'm kind of fascinated by. What's the better vision for the post-single family zoning future? Is it stick plexes or is it missing middle? I've put scare quotes around both of those terms because they might be unfamiliar. So let me just kind of dive into those a little bit. Missing middle housing is associated with an urban designer named Daniel Paralek, who has a firm called Opticos Design, which some of you may remember as the lead consultant that Austin hired in its long multi-year quest to reform its zoning code, which ultimately was kiboshed a few years ago. I don't think that's Paralek's fault. Local politics got very complicated there. But his basic theory is that, in US cities, we're building a lot of detached single family houses. That's over here on the left. And then off to the right, we're building a smaller but still considerable number of, big mid-rise buildings. Picture the kind of housing that's going up along, Burnett Road in Austin or South Lamar, and that we really suffer because we don't build much of the stuff that's in between. And yet, if you go to a lot of beloved historic American neighborhoods, like my old block in Denver, this is precisely the kind of housing, this missing middle housing, this medium density housing that makes it feel livable and human scaled, and yet provides a wide variety of housing at different price points and all that sort of thing. So that's sort of the missing middle, vision of what we would ideally replace single family zoning with in a lot of places. Now, there's this other concept coined, I believe it was coined by Emily Hamilton, who is I think a really insightful housing scholar from George Mason University. And the idea of stick plexes is stick plexes are basically just housing units that are built out of wood framed construction, the same construction technology that single family houses are built out of, which is cheap per square foot. But that unlike most single family detached houses, stick plexes use land efficiently. So Emily Hamilton defines stick plex housing as wood framed housing that uses less than 2,500 square feet per unit. So Houston townhouses would qualify as stick plexes under her definition. And this is where it kind of gets interesting. Dan Paralek and what you might call the missing middle housing purists, they would say, no, 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 stick plex housing is not missing middle housing. If you read this book is kind of Paralek's magnum opus about this concept. He would give you various reasons why this housing development here is not missing middle housing. He would say it's too tall, it's out of scale with the surrounding neighborhood, the parking isn't handled in the right way, it doesn't relate to the street in the right way. He would give you these reasons why he would police the boundaries of missing middle housing in a way that would exclude much of the townhouse development that's happening in Houston. Someone like Emily Hamilton or Salim Firth, who has also written about this, their pushback to the missing middle pushback would be, you're being a purist, you're insisting on this kind of ideal form of housing, and it might not be what developers want to build, and it might not be what home buyers want to buy. And maybe we should just let people build stuff that people want. And that seems to have been what's happened in Houston. So I think there's a really interesting kind of conversation to be had about that tension in that direction. And this issue has arisen in a number of other cities, at a much smaller scale than in Houston, where it's really has happened across large swaths of the city. But the version of this in Denver concerns a new housing form that are called slot houses, that a tweak to one of their zoning categories allowed this kind of townhouse development to happen, and people hated it. And so the city scrambled to revise the zoning code after the fact to begin to kind of clamp down on some of these developments. There is another form that I am sort of fascinated by and that I would like to further study called the Bayonne box. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Bayonne, if I'm saying it right, is a city in Hudson County in New Jersey, and apparently in Jersey City and Hoboken and Bayonne and some of the other cities in this area, which are right across the Hudson River from New York City, they get these kinds of houses being built all over the place, often with multiple units in them. And it's the same kind of controversy, right? People don't like them. They think they're intrusive. They think they're out of scale, but developers like to build them, and a lot of people like to buy them. And one interesting twist in this story is that they're very popular among multi-generational households who love buying these kinds of houses because they find them to be a good place for an extended family grouping to live in. So these sorts of tensions, I think, aren't unique to Houston. So, just to kind of wrap this up, like where am I going with this? One venue I would like to pursue is New York University's Furman Center in partnership with Pew Charitable Trust. They have a call for papers out on the effects of changes to land use law. They say, we will consider papers that analyze any aspect of land use regulation, but should focus on questions of what took place after a policy change. I think I got a story to tell them here with R2TH redevelopment. And then, this type of ongoing research, it's part of a larger book project that I'm pursuing, kind of just embarking on. My working title is From Enclave to Haven, Alternate Visions for the Future of the North American Residential Bloc. And, a couple of years ago, I thought I was going to write a book making the case to repeal single-family zoning. But I actually think that events have sort of overtaken, the need for that book. Single-family zoning repeal has been gathering enough steam that I don't know that book is as necessary. I think the more urgent question now is less, is it a good idea to repeal single family zoning, and more, how do you do it? What do you replace it with? Because I think there are all kinds of different visions for what could replace single family zoning, not just stick plexes, not just missing middle, there are other ones too. And I want to spend the book kind of explaining that. So that's kind of where I'm headed. But at this point, I'll stop and say thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be very excited to have any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jake. It was really great to see what you're working on. There are a couple things in the chat. So Jennifer has a pronunciation note. It's Bayonne, apparently.
Bayonne. Okay. See, I've never lived in the New York metro area, so that I just clowned myself there.
And then does anyone have any questions for Jake? You could feel free to unmute, turn on your camera if you like, ask a question, or drop it in the chat. I can kick us off with one. I've got kind of a meaty one. I was kind of thinking as you were talking, Jake. So it seems like other jurisdictions, at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about these other places that are pushing to eliminate single-family zoning. And you didn't state this, but presumably it's in response to the housing crisis. There's just this kind of sense that where there's not enough housing being produced, single-family zoning is too restrictive. We need to get rid of single-family zoning so we can produce more housing. So there's this kind of idea that more supply will be built, prices will come down, and that will kind of protect against gentrification. More people will be able to purchase homes in the places where they want to live. Mm-hmm. But the work that you just summarized in Houston raised the possibility that this type of eliminating zoning, developing townhomes could actually worsen gentrification. So you were talking about how these condos are, these redevelopments that you were specifically looking into were not being built in gentrifying areas, and that was potentially a good thing. Mm-hmm. So I want to kind of know like what you think we need to understand about this development in order to know whether it's good or bad in terms of gentrification. And I guess just an underlying question, can these zoning changes or changes in land use policy actually protect against gentrification, or do we need more targeted policies that allow people to stay in their homes, that cap rents at reasonable rates, that provide property tax circuit breakers and some of these other policies that we're not allowed to have in the state? So there's a lot in there, but hopefully you can kind of speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that could probably be a whole talk on its own, but just to pick up on a few of those threads you put out there, I think just first, I just need to do a little bit more to understand exactly what's going on and to compare as you saw, I was just putting those two maps up side by side, but I need to do a kind of a more precise analysis of exactly where the development is happening. Like I said before, my initial conclusion was that most of the development seems to be happening not in the highest income neighborhoods and not in the lowest income neighborhoods, but most of it seems to be happening in middle to upper middle income neighborhoods in Houston. I think people who are worried about gentrification, they might view that as good news because, this could be an example of, in the normal American city, I mean, just to sort of give the standard scenario, which I think, Austin very much fits into. In Austin, the wealthy neighborhoods in Austin are basically just off limits to most forms of development other than tearing down small houses and replacing them with giant mansions, right? And so what happens, a huge amount of the pressure for new development gets channeled into areas like East Austin that for historical and other reasons have, slightly more permissive rules that make development easier. And the argument is if you allow more development in more affluent areas, you're going to channel some of that development away from those areas and kind of ease the pressure on them. And so my initial read is that's consistent with what we're seeing in Houston. And so I think even if even if you're a kind of your primary focus is on anti-displacement, even the kind of resolutely pro-free market approach of Houston may have something to recommend it from that standpoint. Now, what you asked about, doing this in a more targeted way and pairing with other policies and so forth, I mean, I think that's a complicated and important and vast set of questions to ask, which I want to explore in the book. I can say that I heard the planning director of Minneapolis speaking the other day, and she said that their effort to repeal single-family zoning is something that bubbled up in the context of a long, comprehensive planning process where the city was trying hard to have searching and, historical conversations about, deep racial inequality that is sort of baked into Minneapolis, like every other big city in the US. And so, the way in her telling, the city wasn't looking to do this. This is something that kind of came up, and people dug into the history of redlining and so forth, and a desire arose to kind of undo the sort of historical wrong. But the conversation might look different in other communities. The impetus to repeal single-family zoning might be more for environmental reasons or more for housing affordability reasons. So I think there are different sources of this sort of impulse to make these kinds of reforms. I'll stop there. There's so much to say about that, but see if there's other questions coming up.
See, Sean, you unmuted. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Although like single family zoning is set to become less stringent, are there new obstacles that you could see popping up? Like I know in California, there's appeals to water scarcity as a reason why you can't have more housing, but also like maybe is there a world in which zoning becomes more lax, but things like design review and minimum lot size remain very stringent regulations that maybe even get bolstered? I don't know. Is that something under? Right.
I think you're right on there, Sean, and because I think repealing, trying to dismantle zoning barriers is often this sort of cat and mouse game. And Sean, you're a Californian, so I'm sure you're familiar with the trajectory of ADU regulation in California, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the basic story, the state of California, as long ago as the early 1980s, passed regulation that sought to prevent cities from putting up all these barriers to people building ADUs. And sorry, I slipped into jargon there, accessory dwelling units, which are kind of small little housing units that are on the same lot as a single family house. And so the state passes a law in the early 1980s that sort of kind of sounds like it's going to prevent cities from preventing ADUs, but in practice, cities come up with all these creative ways to, okay, well, we're going to let you build an ADU, but if you're going to build an ADU, then it has to have, it has to have a mineral bath healing spot. I'm being facetious, but you get the idea. The cities come up with ways to sort of circumvent these sorts of attempts to deregulate them. There is a happy ending in the California story. The state finally said, and I think this is 2017, 2018, they passed a couple of laws, and this is sort of the state sort of figuratively banging its fist on the table and saying, enough. We are once and for all going to stop you from doing this. And there has been an absolute explosion of ADUs in California. So the city of Los Angeles went from permitting, I don't know, like a couple hundred per year, which isn't that much for such a large city with such a, horrendous housing shortage. In like a year, Los Angeles went from a couple of hundred ADU permits per year to thousands per year. So overnight, LA became the ADU capital of America. And so like, I think this will happen with some of these other cases where, a change gets made and then it's not enough and it's not the right kind of a change. And then another change has to be made and it goes on and on and on and on and on.
Thanks, Jake.
Yeah, other questions out there?
Yeah, does anyone else want to unmute and ask a question? If not, there are a few in the chat. So Jennifer has a question about affordability. So Jennifer asks, what is the affordability on these infill townhouses and other missing middle housing? When I perused Zillow for Houston, many were 300,000 or more, not exactly affordable to most people. How would we make these more affordable?
Yeah, well, so the first thing I would say is 300,000, it's true, it's not affordable for a very low income household. But it's astonishingly affordable for the urban core of a growing US city. So the way that I would think about it is it's creating housing that, many middle income households can afford. And I think that's great. It's absolutely true though, that doesn't help the household earning 50% of area median income. But it does make the job easier of nonprofits and other entities that would like to build subsidized housing. So, in US cities, the vast majority of housing that is built by nonprofits is rental housing that uses low-income housing tax credits. And for complicated reasons, that is almost always multifamily housing in large buildings. And a lot of lower income people would like to live in things that aren't multifamily buildings. It would be great if there were more options for them. And if the market rate price for a new townhouse in the urban core is $750,000, then just never in a million years are those housing units going to be subsidized for occupancy by a low income, truly low income household. But if a townhouse can be built for a sales price of $350,000 and you only need to put in $150,000 to $200,000 in subsidy to make that affordable for a household earning, 60% of AMI, then that's feasible, that's doable. Because $250,000 per unit in public subsidy, that's routine. I mean, that's what any project in Houston or Austin or other Texas cities would require. This is a non sequitur. In San Francisco these days, they think nothing of subsidized housing that costs $800,000 per unit. That they're in a different stratosphere.
A comment from Sunny, who says, locally, I'd say townhomes are a precursor to gentrification. Builders go into lower income areas in close proximity to higher income areas, giving credence to your maps, and over time replace lower income housing with expensive single family housing. Townhomes are not a solution to our missing middle problem. I guess that's not a question, but if you want to react to that.
Yeah, well, let me think about my response here. At least my preliminary findings are that, the big clumps of these in neighborhoods like Rice Military, for example, are not really on the edges of low income areas. And, the other thing I would say is a lot of builders would love to build in middle income areas, middle or upper middle income areas. But, the default condition in cities like Austin is that they just can't, it's not worth it to even try. So I think, I don't know, I think that if you're worried about development happening too fast in low income neighborhoods and this kind of destructive dynamic of those areas being flooded with almost all the new development occurring in a city, I think this is at least worth looking at.
A couple other things coming up in the chat from Madison. Thanks for your nuanced take on these issues, Jake. I've heard you speaking about both state and city policy changes. Do you see significantly more opportunity for policy change to create more missing middle housing at the city rather than state level?
Yeah, I think, in a perfect world, I would love for states to take this on. I think that's the best solution because there's such a prisoner's dilemma problem where, one city does it, but then, the surrounding cities don't, and you end up reproducing exclusion that way. And it's just better if the state just sort of sets a universal standard. Am I holding my breath that that's going to happen in Texas? I don't think so. I don't think it's crazy that it could at some point in the future. I actually think it's not impossible that some impetus for this could come from the political right as well as the political left, but that is not mostly what has happened so far, but that could change. But yeah, so in the absence of that, then yeah, it needs to happen. In my opinion, single family zoning reform should take place citywide. when you try to pick off a neighborhood here or a neighborhood there, you end up in this kind of destructive dynamic where one neighborhood will say, why are we the ones that are getting rezoned away from single family detached? Like, why are you picking on us? And in Austin's failed zoning reform, that was a big problem that helped sink Code Next. For those of you who remember that, there was an area in just south of the lake where there was some single family zoning repeal going on, and people there felt really, put upon, like, why is this being done to us and other people get to keep their single family neighborhood? And to me, the only way out of that is just to take it on citywide.
Do you want to take a couple more, Jake? We got a few more in the chat. Are you good?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to stay on as long as people like, but I also recognize people have other things to do. So.
Okay, yeah. So a couple of folks have dropped off, but we still got a pretty good crowd here. So let's just keep going. So Luis mentions that the data do not support that townhomes are a precursor to gentrification, but they're seeing trends that might be changing that dynamic in the future. And then mentions a report that they produced at the Kinder Institute on the topic. So I think you mentioned that report, Jake, but there's the link in the chat for folks. Cody asks, Jake, you mentioned that the townhome lots had a 4.1 to 1 ratio of assessed value compared to the previous use. Mm-hmm. How can the city leverage this increased income to keep momentum going in the right direction? Do you see this often pointed out by missing middle proponents? It seems like you could get the political right on board by emphasizing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point. It doesn't come up very much in these discussions, but I mean, there is a kind of fiscal soundness argument that's part of this. I mean, you're just getting a whole lot more tax revenue out of your urban land when you do this sort of thing, which helps the finances of the city. I also think there could be an anti-displacement angle here too. I mean, through TIF districts or TERS districts or homestead preservation districts. I mean, there are these different mechanisms that could possibly be used to capture some of the property value uplift that occurs, and perhaps plow it into things that that benefit the local residents, so that this doesn't just completely feel like an imposition on them. I think all kinds of things like that should be considered and thought about, but for the most part, we haven't done so yet.
Allison has a question here. So they asked, Dr. Ronaldo Walcott at University of Toronto discusses architectures of care and collectivity that care for the diverse needs of others while promoting collaboration amongst individuals. I feel like the potential of urban townhome style of housing to care for people with children or people with other multi-room needs, especially during COVID, is representative of an architecture of care. It would be interesting to see if children are living in the urban townhomes, as you suggested, and if townhomes have promoted other forms of multi-generational/diverse households. Are there other aspects of urban townhome living that you feel has potential for progressive outcomes? Specifically, would you be interested in studying whether townhomes encourage collectivity?
Yeah, no, I would. The story that I have heard in Houston is a very individualistic one, to be quite frank. So I got the chance to interview Barbara Tennant, who is an architect who was instrumental, and influential in the civic conversations around the initial reforms in the late 90s. She's retired now. But what she told me was the only way that this worked, and the only way that builders got on board, was to make it possible to do what's called fee simple development. So people did not even want these to be condos. They wanted to be your own townhouse on its own lot. In the way she put it was that this never would have gotten traction if they'd been stacked units or otherwise sort of managed in a collective way. So yeah, I'm not sure. I guess the answer to Allison's question, I'm not sure if I see those possibilities in the way that townhouse development is played out in Houston. Now, in the Bayonne story, hopefully I said that right in the end. In the Bayonne story, I think there is a little bit more of that, because one thing I've read, and I'd like to investigate this further, but just there's a lot of interest, specifically in immigrant households in buying those Bayonne box houses so that they can kind of have a multi-generational community. In other contexts, Willow Lung Imam from University of Maryland has written about this a lot in different parts of the country in Asian American immigrant communities. So I do think there are some interesting possibilities there, but also some tensions, because Willow Lung Imam's research, one of the themes is the tensions between immigrants who would like to build and buy very large houses, versus their neighbors who see these as kind of out of place and not harmonious with the surroundings. So I think it very quickly gets interesting and complicated. But I think
do you know, Jake, just following up on Allison's question, has there been any co-housing development pursued in this kind of like townhome, as townhomes have become more common in Houston? It seems like that'd be right for a kind of urban co-housing situation.
Yeah, I am not sure. I don't. Luis Guajardo, who commented earlier, he would know because he's sort of deep into housing in Houston, but I'm not sure if there are any co-housing communities in Houston.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So Michael has his hand up. Michael, do you want to ask Jake a question?
Yeah, I mean, some of what behind this question is kind of anecdotal evidence just from people I know that live in Houston. So, but I mean, the way this works, as I understand it, is developers will kind of go in and almost block bust. In other words, they'll go around, 2 or 3 square block area and say, hey, you can make a lot of money selling your house if you agree to release these covenant, or deed restrictions. Mm-hmm. Majority votes yes. So it's a cash out for the, people in, these single family neighborhoods that get redeveloped. Mm-hmm. And then they're replaced by, I've driven around these and I just got to say, there has to be a better way. I mean, these are most of them are 3-story, which arguably is not that family friendly. They are single, they're like owner occupied houses just stretched out, to 3 stories, and they are, more compact on lots. You get more units per square acre and so on and so forth. But there's no design standards, no idea of kind of trying to put in some soft mixed use. There's no, it's just, I don't know. I guess the advantage is it does absorb, and again, anecdotally, it's largely younger, either families with few kids or, they're replacing, there's actually a decline in population, even though there's this huge increase in units. And so I guess my question is this a model that we really want to, sort of foreground?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we need to study it and look at it. There are aspects of it that I sort of tentatively find interesting and encouraging, but yeah, I guess I haven't made up my mind. I would like to do some more research and see if what you're saying, if that bears out, that the child population goes down, for example. But some of this is just this is a problem that growing cities struggle with, all over the world, and that's that people with more money take up more space. Paris lost 1/3 of its population, I think, from 1920 to 1970 or something like that, and it was not because lots of housing was being torn down in Paris. It was just because the city got wealthier and people took up more space. And maybe building child-friendly, or at least nominally child-friendly housing in the core of the city, maybe that's not enough. Maybe just not enough people want to raise their children in the core of the city, even if they have the housing available. I think that's an open question.
Yeah, I guess a stacked up 3-story house, I don't know how child-friendly it is. I mean, there's probably health benefits because you got to schlep kids and groceries, et cetera, up these like vertical structures. But I don't know how child friendly.
This is pure anecdata, but I have a cousin who raised her 3 boys in a very tall and skinny 3-story townhouse in Chicago. But that's anecdata.
Great.
Yeah, I think what you're bringing up, Michael, are just those are the kinds of questions I want to try to dig into in this book project. I hope to do.
Great. It looks like Maggie has a question. Maggie, do you want to go ahead and ask it?
Yeah, hi. Sort of going off that anecdotal evidence, I'm from the inner loop, and this story is definitely my story of how I've been living. The house I was in for the last 5 years is now one of these. So I definitely feel this a lot. And I think that, this supposed kind of like increase in density, where we would expect that it kind of creates a little bit more diversity and we want to be kind of on board with it, or I at least do in theory. I think what happens is that the people who are moving into these are people who would normally be buying a single family house just a few, miles away or in like a kind of suburban area, but like the idea of being able to have that in a city. Someone was mentioning like $300,000. That's like a third of the price that I've seen these go for. Like the ones that happened on my block were $1 million, like consistently. So I think there is a big conversation about displacement. And most of these become, owner occupied, where maybe the houses before were rented. But on the note about meeting like market desires that you had kind of mentioned in your talk, I wonder if you have looked into it all, like how quickly these sell or resell and how desired they really actually are. Again, anecdotal evidence, like most people I know hate these. And people would talk about like, yeah, there was one on my block and it didn't sell forever. And eventually they tore it down and built a little bungalow or whatever. And then it sold immediately. Or, I've seen ones that have been sitting unsold for years, and just wonder if that's part of your research.
I would like for it to be, I wish I had access to, sales data, but I'm gonna have to work on trying to do that. Everything that I presented was only about property tax assessment data, which, tells you some things, but it doesn't get into those sets of issues. As for the idea that they're not desirable, I don't know. I don't think 25,000 of them would have been built if there wasn't a demand for them. But, but again, that's the kind of thing that it would be great if I could analyze in a more fulsome way.
Okay, any other questions for Jake? There was one other, I just went back through the chat, and someone had asked, what happens to the lot coverage with these new infill townhouses with the increase in FAR? How do we limit the environmental impact? How do we limit their environmental impact?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I'm sure I think the lot coverage is very high. I think there's no preciousness like in Austin about, worrying about stormwater runoff and so forth. And maybe you can make an argument that there should be, given the environmental stresses that Houston is under. On the other hand, a lot of environmental planners, I am not one, but I've heard a lot of them say, we should do a whole lot less worrying about the environmental impacts of infill development and a whole lot more worrying about the alternative, which is, much more land consumptive outward development. So, but that's a complicated set of issues.
Great. Oh, it looks like I see Jennifer has a hand up. Jennifer, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you so much for answering all these questions. This is great. So going back to the idea of who's buying these properties and to whom is this attractive, I guess I'm wondering if you're intending to look at whether this is transplants. And the reason I'm saying this is because I went to UT Austin like 20 years ago, but I'm from the Northeast and I'm back in the Northeast. And while there's certain types of housing that is not necessarily considered attractive to people in the Sun Belt, to people from the Northeast, the house is amazing. It's like amazingly attractive. It's big. You have a garage. You can walk. It's like far more than you ever get in like Jersey City, where I used to live, New York City. And so, and I know I've seen a lot of census data that when New Yorkers are leaving, and a lot of the places are going, Los Angeles, Houston, so on and so forth. So I have a feeling that some of this housing may be being bought by transplants for whom it's almost like this great deal. And I'm wondering if you're intending to look into that.
Yeah, I would love to. That sounds really hard. Now, there are some researchers who have figured out ways using particular data sets to track the moves that people have made. I don't know if I can get access to that data. I'm thinking of some of the research by, for example, people who they've shown, when a new market rate development comes in, where have people moved from to fill up that building? So yeah, that would be really fascinating to look at. I can say that, the data I'm familiar with from other cities, not from Houston, but there's often a perception that brand new construction housing is it's entirely for outsiders and newcomers and transplants. I remember in San Francisco there was a proposal to do a moratorium on a particular neighborhood on new construction in the Mission District, and so as part of that, the city commissioned a study to look at, who are the people who are moving into brand new housing. And it turned out that something like 85 to 90% of the brand new housing units are moved into by people moving from within the city rather than from outside of the city. And I assume that's a fairly common scenario. But I wouldn't be able to say whether that's what's going on with the Houston townhouses. But my suspicion would be that most people moving into townhouses are people who already live in the Houston region.
Great. Okay, so I think I've cleared most of the questions from the chat, and I don't see any other hands raised. So with that, thanks so much, Jake. Clearly a ton of interest in this topic. This was, I think, the most lively discussion we've had so far in a city forum this semester. So thanks so much, and thanks to everyone who attended. And our final city forum will be in 2 weeks. We've got Jesus Barajas from UC Davis presenting. Okay.
Just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you so much for your insightful questions and comments. And I really appreciate your attention on such a beautiful sunny day on a screen.